In this presentation, we'll talk about a few chapters from Julia Schor's book, Do Americans Shop Too Much? And in this book, what she does is she pushes us to be critical of the level of spending and consumption that Americans are engaged in. Many Americans are uncomfortable with the level of spending in consumption, but we often don't reflect about it in terms of making it problematic. We sort of take it for granted, and she's arguing that a critique of consumerism and consumption is desperately needed. She argues that we are in a culture where we are required to work longer and longer hours, our jobs are less secure, and we have a greater pressure to spend the money that we have. It's interesting, George Will, a pretty well-known conservative social thinker, actually made a observation that was related to this point about our lives being or jobs being less secure. He argues that 40 years ago in the 60s, 1970s, that a society was judged as being prosperous if people had secure jobs, and now, instead of the level of employment and job security being a measure of prosperity, it's increasingly defined by the gross domestic product. That is, how profitable are the corporations that exist in a particular society as a measure of how prosperous a nation is. So we really have gotten away from the day-to-day lives of people as a measure of how prosperous. That is less our focus, and you see that reflected in an increased likelihood that people are moving from job to job, and many people in times of economic stress are laid off, not because they're not doing a good job in their roles that they play, but rather that corporations are more focused on profits rather than they are providing secure employment for their employees. Okay, so when we talk about these types of issues, what we tend to focus on is the redistribution of income, but we rarely talk about the level of consumption. We essentially take that for granted, and many people just aspire to be able to consume in the ways that people who are higher up in socioeconomic status ladder consume. So people want to, people in the working class want to spend and consume at middle class levels, and middle class folks want to consume like upper middle class or wealthy folks. Now, there's a pressure to consume that comes from the social context, right? And this is in conflict with our emphasis on individualism. In our society, our dominant ideology argues that people consume based on their own individual choices, but Schor is saying that's not true. That there's a social context of spending that pressures people to consume more than they need to, or potentially ought to. For example, just put a picture of a dining room table up here. Well, when I moved to Atlanta, I got my job here as a professor at Georgia State, and at the time I had been living literally in poverty as a graduate student, making about $13,000 a year for about 6 years running. And so when I moved down to Georgia, I didn't have a dining room table. I didn't have hardly any furniture at all, and but there was a pressure to spend money instead of being able to spend the money the way I wanted. The first semester I was here, I was pressured to host a dinner for incoming professor candidates, and the idea is that if I was going to host a dinner party at my house, then I had to have the furniture that normal people have. So I was pressured into buying a dining room table along with some other furniture, because that came with the social expectations that came with my job. Same type of thing as if you were, for example, the dean of the college here at Georgia State, often is expected to host parties at their home for people who have been hired or promoted and tenured and that type of thing. And a dean may make quite a bit of money, and a dean might make $200,000 a year, and it's not as if it's up to them to completely how they spend their money. It's not as if the dean can make $200,000 a year and choose to live in a one-bedroom apartment and sock away all the rest of their money. Um, Instead, there's a social expectation that the dean should live in a home that's large enough and fancy enough to host a dinner um, with a large number of people and represent the college in a positive way. It's the same type of thing that exists when people have jobs where they're expected to wear a suit and tie or business attire. You may get a job that has these expectations. What comes with that job is a demand that you dress in a certain way, regardless of whether there's a budget um, for that type of investment. An example of this is my wife used to work for a consulting firm, and she was the second highest ranking person in this company, and her boss had a fancy car that they would often drive clients around in. This was, I think it was a Lexus, and it had all the bells and whistles. And my wife, on the other hand, she drove a Honda Civic, and it was old, but it was reliable and it was safe, but it didn't have any of the fancy bells and whistles. And her boss consistently pressured her into getting and buying a more fancy car so she could represent her company in a more positive light. So the idea here is there's a social expectation of spending your money in a particular way depending on your position in society. So not only is there pressure to spend money, but also there's what Schor calls competitive consumption, that people are often um, uh, striving to outspend people, try to keep up with the Joneses. That is, to in the past, this phrase "keeping up with the Joneses" often meant um, keeping up with people who were in your same social class, people who lived on your street. But increasingly, people are aspiring to live a lifestyle not of people in their same social class, but rather sort of an aspirational spending um, beyond their means. Right? So, in short, luxury is increasingly replacing comfort as a common aspiration, that people want to not just be comfortable in their lives, but they want to lead luxurious lives, even if they can't afford to do so. And this is fueled by the mass media, who constantly exposes us to a world through advertising the media that is overly materialistic and luxurious, and we tend to think increasingly that is a normal lifestyle, and we should aspire to have that type of lifestyle. So this started perhaps with a famous TV show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, and this was one of the early reality TV shows in which, in the 1980s, people were exposed to the lifestyles of the rich and famous. You get a glimpse of how the very wealthy lived, how the famous people lived, and it affected the aspirations of the common person. And this is just the beginning of reality shows. Platinum Weddings is another example, where in this show you'll follow people who are about to get married, and these are extraordinarily wealthy people who might spend $300,000 or $400,000 on a wedding, and so you get to see all the different things that they spend their money on. Maybe $50,000 are spent on the flowers for the wedding, and the food, and the cake might be $3,000 or $4,000 for a wedding cake, and then of course the rings and the dresses and the reception hall and all these types of things. And so ordinary people, watch this show and see that some people are getting married with all these bells and whistles. And the sad thing is that some people adopt this view that they have to have all those things in order to get married. In short, there's an increased focus on materialism in our society, our culture, that is driven by the media. And who is driving this? Well, the people who fund these programs are advertisers, and through their advertising, not only during the commercials but also in the shows themselves, they send a message of what our lives ought to be like, what normal is, and we need as consumers to be thoughtful as we reflect upon these messages that we're getting, and be critically thoughtful about whether we should adopt the culture that we're being taught to adopt. All right, so this increased focus on materialism has had a direct impact on the savings rate in our society. And here's a few statistics that give you some perspective. If you go back to the 1980, the average savings rate in the United States was 8%. That is that the average person would sock away into savings 8% of their income. By the early 1990s, that had dropped in half to 4%, and then in the year 2000, it was 0%. So in the year 2000, the average person in our society was spending all the money that they made. And then in the year 2005, for the first time since the Great Depression, there was a negative national savings rate. That is, as a society as a whole, we were spending more money than we were making, which is unsustainable. This was the case in 2005, 2006, 2007, and then what happens in 2008, you have the Great Recession, and it's just a reflection of how this is an unsustainable spending pattern. In fact, Schor's book is sort of sees this coming and is warning us to adopt some alternative view of our spending and our consumption patterns. So essentially what she's arguing is you have these different aspirations that people have, and what's creating this focus on materialism is a decline in community, that people are not connected with other human beings, and then increasingly they're focused on their possessions rather than their relationships. There's a growing level of inequality, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, an increasing role in the mass media promoting a level of consumption that fuels this gap between what people have and what people desire to have. So her overall point is it's hard for people to think out their way out of this consumerism. We are inundated with these messages of how we should live our lives. And so she's arguing that we should have collective efforts rather than relying on the individuals themselves to think about spending their money in different ways. Capitalists, their advertisers, are very good about teaching us that we should we should live a certain type of life, and increasingly that life is focused on material possessions more than what Schor would argue, and frankly what Marx would argue would make for a meaningful life, a happy life, and that is relationships with other human beings. Another reality here, another set of statistics that is related to this is the average level of credit card debt in our society is $7,000 per household, and on average that means that households are spending $1,000 just on the interest. So the banks are making quite a bit of money promoting this level of consumption beyond one's means. People end up going into debt, and as a result, banks are making a tremendous amount of money on that debt. People tend to underestimate how much debt they actually have, and you may relate to this next statistic that there is actually more student loan debt than there is credit card debt. So this level of debt has tremendously negative effect on our happiness, our well-being, and perhaps you as an individual can reflect upon whether this is worth it, and maybe try to restrict your spending and try to save money as people did a few generations ago, and not worry so much about having all the new fancy material items, and as a result you may be able to not fall into debt. This is can be done at the individual level, but Schor obviously is arguing for it being at a collectivist level, doing things as a society. There's also social movements in this direction. You may have heard of a social movement called Voluntary Simplicity. It's essentially, the name explains what it is. It's basically people who voluntarily choose to lead simple lives or simplified lives, not focused on material possessions. Many people engage in this as a way to get out of debt, but not everyone. Many people who have no problem with debt also are choosing to lead simple lives, not focus on material possessions. So there are some people out there who are challenging the messages of the dominant ideology in this arena. Okay, another statistic that shows the negative results of this level of consumption, that is the level of bankruptcies and how they've increased significantly over time. In 1980, there were 200,000 bankruptcies in the United States. In 1998, there were 1.4 million. In the year 2010, there were 1.6 million. So long story short, people are spending money beyond their means, and as a result going into bankruptcy or foreclosure because they just simply can't afford to maintain the level of consumption that they are engaged in. All right, so Schor basically argues there's four ways that we can spend our money. There's private consumption, which essentially is buying things, possessions, for ourselves. There's public consumption, which refers to essentially taxes, where we pay our taxes, and then as the government does things like builds roads or provides public education or other things that taxes go to. There's savings, which we talked about just a moment ago. Increasingly, people are saving less and less money, but that's something that people can do, spend their money on. And lastly, there's leisure. This is rather than buying possessions, which would be private consumption. Here we're talking about just leisure activities, vacations, going to movies or something like that would be leisure activities. Essentially, what Schor is arguing is that private consumption is crowding out the rest of these three. That is, we're increasingly focused on just buying stuff rather than spending money. So, for example, when it comes to public consumption or taxation, there's a consistent resistance on the part, especially of conservative politicians, to raise taxes in any way. In fact, there's pressure to sign pledges to never raise taxes, and that it's fueled by this idea that we need to pump more and more money into the economy that will lead to profits of corporations, and so that is really focusing on private consumption. As we talked about before, savings rate is increasingly less common, and people are spending less money on leisure, which actually may lead to them developing relationships with other people. In fact, many people who are given vacation days feel a pressure by their employer to not take their vacation days because if they do, then they'll have a greater demands on their jobs when they get back. So long story short, there's a increased focus on not interfering in terms of the government coming in and shaping the way we spend our money. There's a view that consumers, people who are spending their money, are rational, well-informed, they're consistent in their preferences, that their preferences are independent of others, and that the consumption has no negative environmental effects. These are the assumptions that are espoused in terms of the dominant ideology, and the result is it leads to what Schor calls a hands-off policy. This is very much in line with Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism, what we talked about earlier in the semester. And as we talked about before, Ayn Rand believes that the consumers should make their own well-informed and rational choices. But this philosophy also believes that corporations and companies will provide information about their products and let the consumer make well-informed choices. The question is, are we truly well-informed? Are our preferences, do they emerge independent of other outside pressures, or are there outside pressures that push us to consume in a particular way? And also, Schor is pointing out that we need to take seriously the idea of the negative environmental effects that result from our productive process. Okay, another famous sociologist talks about this. Pierre Bourdieu developed this idea of cultural capital, and he's essentially saying that people gain or lose or reproduce their status in society by buying particular possessions. He talked about this as objectified cultural capital, and so we essentially demonstrate our success and our standing in society by the types of possessions that we have, the clothing we wear, the cars we drive, the purses we carry. All these are symbols or signals to other people about how successful we are and how much esteem they should hold us in. So there's a social pressure to consume, to buy these high status possessions. And along with this comes what she calls a positional treadmill. Essentially, this is the pressure for people to live beyond their means, to, like I said before, for working class people to live middle class lifestyles, for middle class people to live upper middle class lifestyles, and upper middle class folks to live wealthy lifestyles. This is what's expected, what is emphasized in our culture, and it is simply not possible to do indefinitely, because what is happening is people are living beyond their means, they're going into debt, and it has tremendously negative effects on their overall well-being. So there's also an interesting example. She talks about how some people attempt to place an emphasis on relationships rather than stuff, and so they may desire to have jobs that aren't as all-consuming as most jobs in capitalism are. That is, that they want to focus on free time rather than income. If a person wants to work not a 40-hour week job, but wants to work a 60% time jobs, they would take a hit in terms of income. That you can't simply say, well, I want to work 60% of the time you're asking me, and I will take 60% of the income. You'll actually likely be paid much less than that. So there's severe penalties for people who do not follow the norm of having a full-time job, which really is consuming the vast majority of their waking hours. Okay, so what is Schor suggesting? She says, she's talking about this politics of consumption, and here are some of the major tenets that she puts forward. She argues that people should have a right to a decent standard of living, that there should be a focus on quality of life rather than the quantity of stuff. Increasingly, she argues in our culture that level of consumption is what is being promoted as an indication of success. But she's arguing that consumption and well-being are not the same thing, that we should focus on the quality of people's lives rather than just simply how much they're paid or how much stuff that they have. She also argues that it's really important that we consume in ecologically sustainable ways. That is, we don't damage the environment as we are leading our lives. We need to try not to support companies that are polluting the environment, for example, and all in the name of profit. She also argues that we should have a greater level of democracy in our society when it comes to our consumption patterns, and that would be indicated by taxation on higher-end items, luxury items. So we do have some of this, for example, where if you're buying a yacht, for example, which is seen as a luxury, you may pay very high price or very high taxes on that. And then low-end items that are necessary, so food, for example, may be go without being taxed. This is there are examples of this. She's arguing that it should be increased, it should be more common, and the idea here is to give people an incentive to simplify their lives. Now, she also emphasizes the retail environment, and I want to talk about this example related to Walmart, which is the number one largest real retail store in the country, and their effect on our culture. Now, Walmart promotes a brand, their brand of being a family-friendly store, and this has implications for what's available to us as consumers because of their such a large segment of the retail market. So essentially, what I'm saying is that they have a preemptive censorship of what is available to us. And so let me tell you what I'm talking. Give you an example of what I'm talking about. Hypothetically, say that there's a musician out there who is of tremendous talent, and this musician wants to produce a particular type of music, and say that their cultural choice is that this music ought to be sort of cutting edge, and it may not, it may have some language that might not be acceptable to Walmart, who, there may be explicit language and whatnot in the lyrics. So if this person is trying to sell their product in a Walmart store, they may be asked to change their product, that they may be change the lyrics, and this person may not be willing to change that artistic choice that they've made, and so they may not be able to sell their product in Walmart, right? And if you step back, it may happen not just at that level, but also a talent scout looking for someone who they want to sign to a record label may come to the conclusion that while this person might be talented, they can't sell their product in a mainstream store like Walmart, so they won't sign them to begin with. That's what I mean by a preemptive censorship. The idea here is that Walmart is shaping what is available to us because people who decide what to produce or what to sell to the rest of us is shaped by what they can get into these large big box stores. And those stores are shaping our culture by shaping what we have to buy. So let me tell you a story from my childhood that sort of makes this point. When I was a child in the 1970s, on 4 different occasions we drove from San Diego to Toledo, Ohio, where my extended family lives. And so we would pack the 12 of us into a large van, and we'd drive across the country. Now, we'd stop at roadside rests and gas stations along the way, and if you weren't alive in the 1970s, then you won't realize this, but back then there was something sort of culturally different. The way we drank sodas was different, right? Typically now they're in cans, but back then there were a lot of glass bottles with bottle caps, similar to the way people drink beer today. And we would, as a sort of game or an activity to keep us occupied across in these cross country trips, we would stop at these roadside rests and gas stations, and we would pick up the bottle caps. And by the time we went from San Diego to Toledo, Ohio, and back, all of us, all 12 of us, or all 10 of the kids, would have big bags full of these bottle caps. The reason why I'm talking about these bottle caps that was fascinating is, yes, we had a lot of Coke and a lot of Pepsi, but there were so many different types of sodas that were sold that were regionally available. For example, you might have some that were sold only in Arizona or only in New Mexico, only in Oklahoma, right? Local bottling companies, and those really don't exist anymore, right? The diversity that we have in terms of sodas in the 1970s, there was tremendous diversity. Now there's very little diversity. You go across the country and you go into any gas station and you'll find the same sodas in Oklahoma or California or Ohio. It doesn't matter. They'll all be the same. It's the result of this retail environment that is dominated by a few corporations, and they really shape what is available to us. So Schor is being critical of this on this point 5 here about the politics of retailing. She'd argue that we should have some spaces where we don't have advertising available, but we should get advertisers out of public schools, which they are currently a revenue source for public schools, but at what cost? And also when I'm talking about sodas, I'm talking about the diversity of retailing, that we should have not just limited number of stores, but we should have a diversity of stores. So let me talk to you about an example. I mean, I go to a particular shopping center near my house, Edgewood Shopping Center, which is right a few miles away from Georgia State's campus. And at that shopping center, they have a Kroger and a Lowe's, a Borders and a Office Depot, and a Starbucks coffee and a PetSmart. Now, you would argue, well, these are not monopolies; they have competitors. But if you think about who's competing with these stores, you'll find that if you go to any decent-sized city across this country, you'll find this same type of shopping center with similar stores. They may not be the exact same stores, but they're selling similar things. So instead of a Kroger here, you might find a Publix. Instead of a Lowe's, you might find Home Depot. Instead of Borders, you might find Barnes & Nobles. Office Depot, instead you might get Office Max. Instead of a Starbucks coffee, you might get Caribou Coffee. Instead of PetSmart, you might get Petco. These parallels go on and on and on. My point is that there is very limited competition, very limited diversity in the retail options that we have, and as a result, our culture is more restricted to what is, at least our materialistic culture is restricted to what is available in these stores. And so we don't even have a concept of the way things were in the past, how they're, and my example of soda diversity in the 1970s is just one example, but there are countless examples of how it is possible for us to have a wider variety of things, but we set up a economy and a culture which is very mundane, very vanilla, very lacking a level of diversity that we would actually potentially benefit from, in Schor's opinion. A couple other points she talks about, that she encourages people to be willing to spend more money to pay for things that are produced in responsible ways rather than sweatshops. This idea that we should demand information about how the products we buy have been produced, and if they are not consistent with our values, then we should be unwilling to pay for those. And also she argues that we should have a movement at the government level to, as she mentioned earlier, increase taxes on luxury items, to incentivize green production, to limit advertising, regulate consumer credit, which actually has happened to some degree in the last few years, to support international environmental standards. She also encourages government regulation in terms of encouraging retail diversity, as I just talked about, and preserving open spaces and protecting them from corporate interests. Now, to step back and think about this more broad terms, Schor quotes a statement signed by a majority of the Nobel Prize winners in 1993, and that statement read as follows: Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course, and that the current practices put at serious risk the future that we may wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. So really what this is saying is that our consumption patterns are threatening our way of life, that we cannot continue to consume at this level indefinitely. So it's I can't imagine a more weighty issue, but we tend to turn a blind eye to the implications of our consumption patterns, and they are profound. In a more recent report in 2009, there was an identification of 9 different what's called planetary boundaries, issues about our environment that need to be in place for our society, for our world to be inhabitable, and they argued that 3 of these 9 had exceeded safe operating zones. That is the climate, biodiversity, and what they refer to as the nitrogen cycle. And then there were 4 other of these planetary boundaries that were approaching these limits: fresh water use, land use, ocean acidification, and the phosphorus cycle. Now, I'm not a scientist and that would be able to understand all the details of this, but it is quite troubling when you have a number of scientists are arguing that our environment is approaching safe operating levels or exceeding safe operating levels. It's quite troubling. What I can understand is that right now we're going through what Schor refers to as planetary ecocide, and that is essentially we are going through a mass extinction. There have been 5 previous mass extinctions in Earth's history. We know that the last mass extinction happened about 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct, and we are losing diversity, the plant and animal species going extinct on that scale right now. So it's a tremendously problematic process, and Schor is arguing that our productive process, our consumption levels, and emphasis on material possessions is driving this mass extinction, and really threatening the viability of our species. Okay, so one thing she's arguing for instead, so what can we do about this? Again, she's arguing that we should focus on not material possessions, but relationships with other people. She emphasizes rather than monetary wealth, people can focus on what she calls time wealth. The idea of shortening the work week is critical to this, very similar to what Marx was talking about with socialism, if you remember correctly, or remember what we were talking about earlier in this semester. She says this extra time that people would gain by shortening the work week would free up ourselves to be able to be more self-sustaining, that we would be able to diversify our skills and be able to produce things on our own, or repair the things that we have rather than having to buy new things. We'd also be able to connect with other people and lead to more productive and more enjoyable lives, and less of a life that is less of a threat to our natural environment. Okay, now Betsy Taylor also wrote a chapter in Juliet Schor's book, and she builds off of what Schor is talking about, and this is another chapter I wanted to cover in this presentation. And she asks the question, what is America's most popular pastime? And you may not be surprised that the most popular pastime is watching television. But what's interesting is, what is the second most popular pastime after television? Well, it might come as a surprise that recreational shopping is the second most popular pastime. That is, people go shop not because they need things, but because they just enjoy the process of buying things. And this is a reflection, in my opinion, of the power of corporations to separate us from our money, essentially get us to buy things, just engage in the process of shopping. So you think about yourself, whether you engage in recreational shopping or do you just buy things that you need. So essentially, Taylor is arguing that Americans are working longer hours, they're going into more debt, they have fewer hours to enjoy the things that they do have, and there's tremendous environmental damage that's caused by this level of consumption. And so she's echoing what we just talked about with Schor, and she talks about in some specific ways. In the United States, we have 5% of the world's populations, but we consume 30% of the natural resources. So some perspectives on this. The United States owns 40% of the, or we consume 40% of the world's gasoline, and we own 32% of the world's cars. If you're living here in Atlanta, you know how this can, how we're such an individualistic, automobile-focused culture. And I thought this was funny. The prepare to be annoyed sign. We all live through that type of reality here in Atlanta. This is a tremendously troubling and thought-provoking statistic that Taylor puts forward, and that is, since 1940, Americans alone, that is, people in North America, have used up a larger share of the Earth's mineral resources than all previous human beings put together. That is, so if you look at what has been consumed in North America since 1940, so that's the last 75 years, we have used up a larger proportion of the Earth's mineral resources than all human beings that lived prior to 1940. So we are digging these huge holes in the ground to get mineral resources. We're chopping down mountains to get the minerals inside, and it has tremendous negative consequences for our environment because we're not taking everything that we're only taking some of the mineral resources, but we're disturbing all the dirt and soil and whatnot, and that runs off into our other parts of our environment and can be detrimental to our environment. She argues that if everyone on Earth consumed the way the average North American did, we would need 4 extra planets to supply the resources that absorb the waste. But the reality is we only have one Earth. We can't all worldwide consume as in the way that we are in North America, but we are exporting that consumption pattern around the world, and this needs to be addressed in a serious way, or the viability of our species is really in question. I don't think I can overstate the significance of this type of thing. We also have the unintended consequences of this consumption, such as global warming, as I'm sure you're well aware of, rapid deforestation. We're chopping down trees, and this is critically important. These forests are producing the oxygen that we breathe. There's a symbiotic relationship between plants and animals, and we simply cannot survive if we continue to chop down our forests at the rate that we're doing that. We also are depleting our oceans, fish stocks in our oceans. Over 25% of the world's fish stock has been depleted. This is done through fishing practices where we have massive nets that just, miles long, that take all the fish in the ocean, and the large fish are increasingly threatened because they simply don't have time to grow to maturity and reproduce before they're caught. So that's a tremendous problem. We are also, Taylor argues that it is potentially possible that we lose hundreds of plant and animal species, including quite possible that we will lose all the large mammals in the wild over the next 50 years. That these are, we're damaging the environment where these large mammals exist, and we're killing them off, poaching them for their ivory tusks, for example, with elephants and whatnot. Okay, so long story short, there's a tremendous environmental threat as results from our consumption patterns, but it's also impacted the social lives of people in the United States. So there are 35 million Americans living below the poverty line, and there are many people who are affluent and middle class. They've focused more on this culture of luxury rather than focusing on the implications for people who are living in poverty. This positional treadmill, as Schor talked about, leads people to look up and focus on themselves, being overly individualistic and having material possessions of luxurious items rather than looking at the consequences that people living in poverty here in this country, and even more troubling levels of poverty throughout the world. So she argues that we should focus on fun rather than stuff, similar to this time wealth that Schor was talking about. That we should focus on time rather than money. She argues that we could conceivably shun things that are that have corporate logos and whatnot, and focus on simple, real, and non-commercial items. Again, this is a call for engaging in what could aptly be described as voluntary simplicity, that we're not going to pay extra to have something that has a corporate logo, and we don't want to walk around as billboards for some corporation. All right, she's arguing that, like Schor did, that there's a homogenization of retail environments, and so that is, as I talked about before, creating a single type of culture lacking a level of diversity that once existed in our society. Now, the last chapter I want to talk about from this book is written by Douglas Holt, and what's interesting about his contribution is, whereas Schor and Taylor are more coming from a Marxist perspective, Holt is coming from a perspective that is more consistent with Georg Simmel's critique of urbanization, as we talked about earlier in the semester. And what he's arguing is that what's driving this level of consumption isn't that we have this positional treadmill, or that we want to emulate people who are wealthier than us or be like people who are wealthier than us. Instead, he's arguing that it is the engagement of an open-ended process of self-creation. So as what Simmel was talking about, if you remember, is he was talking about how people in urban settings were freed up to engage in a positive, the positive aspects of the fragmentation of self, that people could try out different identities that in urban settings. People could be creative in how they choose to live their life rather than being constrained as they were in the rural settings. And so he says that what a good life is not so much focused on having possessions, but instead it is engaging in a variety of cultural activities. So essentially Americans are spending a lot of money to circulate through new experiences, things, meanings. This is what is driving our level of consumption. And when people engage in these different activities, it requires a lot of money, in some cases a lot of debt, to experience this wide variety of activities. And so in the end, Holt is more pessimistic about our ability to change our consumption patterns on a mass scale, because he believes that corporations would be very good at just essentially remarketing to us those things that we make to be alternatives to what corporations are selling to us. So, for example, if people collectively shunned a particular item, that the new item that replaced that would be adopted by corporations and be remarketed to us. So a couple examples of this may be, for example, at one point in time, some musicians or from the hip-hop culture are essentially arguing against this level of corporate marketization, and encourage people simply to wear plain white t-shirts. And this happened for a while, but then eventually corporations started to just simply market t-shirts, plain white t-shirts, with their corporate logo, and they promoted these as being higher status, and people started buying the new plain white t-shirts with the say the Nike label on it, for example. The same type of process is taking place, for example, with organic foods. 10 or 15 years ago, there may be a rejection of corporate farming practices that individuals were not comfortable with those practices. They weren't not seen as consistent with their values, and so they demanded organic alternatives. Holt would simply say that this organic food movement has been co-opted by corporations, and now that it's just being remarketed to us in a way that is profitable and leads to levels of consumption that is consistent with the way things were before. So that gives you an overview of Schor's, Taylor's, and Holt's ideas. I hope you found these ideas interesting, and perhaps you will reflect upon them in terms of your own level of consumption. You may end up consuming things in a way that leads you to being a happier person, and perhaps living with less debt if you adopt some of the ideas that they're suggesting. And anyway, regardless of how this affects your own personal consumption patterns, I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them on our Desire to Learn website discussion page. And thank you very much for listening.